hey, welcome back to this week of HSM Reads the Bible, the podcast. My name's Zach.
I'm Makayla.
I'm Dylan.
And today we are covering our reading from Numbers chapter 22 to Deuteronomy chapter 10. So lots of exciting stuff to cover. I know, Makayla, you've said pretty high praise of Deuteronomy in the past.
Oh, yeah. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible.
And so I'm really excited to be able to talk through this week's reading with you guys. So 3 questions that we want to hit every week. What do we see about God in this week's reading? What do we see about, that's fair. What do we see about God's people? And what are some questions that we have coming out of this passage? This week's reading has been my stand-in default example of a passage we might need to talk about because there is a talking donkey. So
there is that.
We'll get to that. But to begin, man, what do you guys see about God in this week's reading?
I think the main thing is just that God has been so kind and so faithful, despite, a long laundry list of reasons why he didn't have to be.
Yeah.
But he's been true to his word and his covenant, and he's been very kind to them.
Man.
I think specifically from the talking donkey story, I mean, really, this was a continuation of last week, and so we still see a lot of the justice, a lot of, Israel getting punished. I think it literally says that God punishes Israel as the father punishes his son. But one of the things that I saw specifically in the story of Balaam was that God protects his people.
Yeah.
We see a king that's like, I will make you so rich if you curse the Israelites. And God uses a extremely corrupt individual to say no. He actually does the opposite. He blesses Israel 3 or 4 times. And in spite of their faithfulness, in spite of their unfaithfulness, I thought that was really interesting. That was cool.
Yeah. Man, kind of pulling out of both of what y'all were saying, his kindness and also his protection, I saw a lot of God's power on display this week. You get, God is using a donkey at the beginning of our text to speak his word and to protect his people. God uses this false prophet. We don't really know what's going on with Balaam, but it's not good. But God uses him to bless his people. When we get into Deuteronomy and they're getting ready to take over the land and God's recapping, everything he's done. He's like, hey, just a reminder, I rescued out of Egypt. I conquered all the gods and all of Pharaoh's army. I drowned everyone in the Red Sea. That was me. And then he's also promising, hey, as you go into the land and you've got these nations that are bigger than you and stronger than you, they're populated by these people that are terrifying to you, I am going to destroy them. It's almost like God's like, watch, I'm just going to flick, and they're done. And so I saw a lot of God's power on display this week. I don't know. What else did you guys see in the text?
I love the first, we were talking about this a second ago, the first couple chapters, actually more than a couple, the first really 10, 15 chapters of Deuteronomy is just a retelling of the wilderness narrative. And seeing time after time after time after time again, just God's patience, his protection, his provision, and the deliverance of his people. I don't know. It was really powerful. We spent, where are we, week 6? Is that what we're in?
Week 6.
Week 6. Yeah, the first, or I guess really 3 or 4 weeks looking at the wilderness narrative just to see the first few chapters of Deuteronomy almost like a ribbon on top of the present that was that story. It was just I don't know. It's cool.
Yeah. One thing I thought was interesting is there's a stereotype of God, specifically Old Testament God, because like I said earlier, we like to think of him there's a different, we wouldn't say he's different, but we think of God in the Old Testament as one way and God in the New Testament is a different way.
To be fair, there have been different folks whose view of the Bible is that God is different from the Old and the New Testament. We would reject that view, but that's been out there for a long time.
Yeah. We would say not true, just a poor reading. But specifically, one thing I have heard people say is that God is anti-women, or maybe maybe they wouldn't say it that harshly, but they would just say well, there could have been some more rights for women or whatever.
Right.
In the end of Numbers, I'm going to say his name wrong, but the daughters of something.
Zelophehad?
Sure. Zelophehad.
We'll go with it.
They go to Moses and they're like, hey, we have no brothers. Our father has died. And his name and his estate are not going to go to us. And just in this very bold way, I say to Moses, would you intercede to the Lord on our behalf and ask that we would get to carry on our name? And God says, yeah, sure, man. Or sure, girls, whatever. And I just thought that was so unlike how we would expect God to act, that he actually makes provision for women in a way that is countercultural, that the cultures at that time would never have done that. And so the Lord is putting a level of dignity and honor on women that didn't exist in that time.
Yeah. Even if we go back to like in Exodus where we were reading Moses on Sinai and God giving some of the initial parts of the law, so much of the law is focused on like, man, what does it look like to protect widows, and how do we care for women, and what what do we do with the women, or the widows, the orphans, the foreigners. And so much the heart of God is to care for and protect those people.
Yeah.
That's huge. Another group that shows up in an interesting way, a lot of Deuteronomy is going to be dedicated to the destruction of these foreign people. But there are a couple of people that God says, hey, actually, like, don't you raise your hand against them. And they're the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Lot, who are not part of God's covenant with Abraham. These are people on the outside of it, but they're people that God has made promises to along the way. He's promised that he would still care for Esau. He's promised that he would protect Lot, even when Lot had clearly did not deserve it in the Sodom and Gomorrah episodes. But even all the way down here, as God's covenant people are making their way to the land, he's still being faithful to these almost like offhand seeming promises that he's made. And I think it's just this reminder of when God makes his promise, it's as good as done. He's the one who holds the receipts, and he is never going to fail in those places.
I would say alongside of that, you kind of already said it, but there's so many instances in Deuteronomy where God is like, do not play with the people of other gods, of who like have their own idols and worship in their own way. He's like, don't marry them, devote them to complete destruction, because if you don't, we've already seen what's going to happen, but it'll happen again. That evil just will sink in, and you will adopt, you will forget. Remember and forget are like two refrains all through Deuteronomy, but you can just see like God's like, not even a little, get it all out. And man, if that doesn't apply to us today, that we love to dabble with sin. We love to dance right up to the line. There was actually, I was talking to one of my friends the other day. I'm going to maybe not say exactly how she did, but it was such a good quote. She said somebody had recently said to her, why would you think that something that breaks the heart of God is going to fulfill you? And it sounds obvious when we say it like that, but yet think about our own lives and how often do we dabble with sin? And there's just something that struck me in the way that God is like, do not touch, do not look, do not play.
Man, to kind of take a personal spin on it, like, and this is going to sound like, oh, that's really pastoral and whatever, but like, it was a conviction that I had to come to like within the last year of this idea of like, hey, I will refuse to be entertained by that which you died for. And just coming to a realization of like, even having walked with Jesus now for over 20 years, working as a pastor, all this stuff, like the number of things in my life that it was like, oh yeah, like I'm watching this and the jokes are all based around sin, or like I'm listening to this and the content, like I can say, I can make all these excuses like, oh, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't whatever, but it's just like, man, I'm choosing to be entertained and enjoy things that grieve the heart of God. And I think it's such a good picture of God's direction to Israel there, of like, no, like, don't even let any of it in, because he knows what would happen if they do. And spoiler alert, they don't drive everyone out of the land. They don't completely devote the gods of the land to destruction, and ultimately it ends in Babylon.
It's hard to read because on the flip side of him saying that, like, he's like, don't do it, be holy as I'm holy, and then he's like, and if you obey me, like, this is what is coming for you. And you're like reading like, yes, that sounds so good. But like you said, like if you've read the Bible before, you know what's coming, and it's also so sad. It's like, oh, you're gonna give all of that up for this that you think is good.
Well, and the crazy piece is it's not even like if you've read through the Bible before. It's if you're reading in Deuteronomy 4, God's like, and you're not going to do this, and the result of this is going to be you're going to be exiled from the land, and you're going to be cast out, and you're going to serve these foreign nations. But then you're going to cry out to me, and I'm going to rescue you, and I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to restore you, because that's who I am. there's so much, so much to Deuteronomy,
I know there is.
and all that God has to say there.
Yeah, there really is. And I think that, like, what you just said there, like, yeah, you're going to fail at this, but, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be faithful to my side of the covenant, I think goes back to the covenant God made with Abraham, in that this mic keeps falling down again. That is so funny. But it goes back to the covenant God made with Abraham in his promise to his people, to basically carry their guilt as well, to take that on for himself, because he knows that they're not going to be faithful. He knows that they're going to mess up, and I think that's really interesting.
I think based, kind of what you're saying there and some of the stuff we're talking about, there is this interesting, maybe, I don't know if you want to say contrast, if you want to talk about it as like, it almost seems like it's coming from two different directions. But on the one hand, we have this idea of like, in the covenant, God holds the receipts, and he's the one who guarantees the covenant. He promises to take on the punishment and the payment of it. And then here in Deuteronomy especially, there is like a real link between obedience and blessing, obedience and receiving what God's promised. And I wonder if we could maybe just chew on those a little bit and think like, how do we understand that? Where's the line? Because, Jesus says things like, hey, if you follow after me, like, you're going to have trouble in the world. So there's definitely not this promise of like, if you do the right thing, things are always going to go well for you. But there is definitely a link between obedience and blessing, disobedience and exile. I don't know. Can we think about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is that God is so much more concerned with our hearts than we give him credit for. And I just think it's so connected to what you're describing of, it's less about, I mean, God does care about obedience for the sake of obedience, but it's less about getting the actions right, and it's more about a heart that is in reverence towards him.
Yeah.
And that, like we've just described, that is so much harder than we would think it would be.
Yeah. I think it goes back to a little bit, and this is a little bit of a, not left turn, but when Israel is faithful again, like you said, the beginning of Deuteronomy 8, which is one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, God says, "Be careful to do every command that you may live and multiply in the land and possess the land that the Lord God swore to give to your fathers." And we see that the people are driving out these nations because of God's promise to them, but also because of the great wickedness of these nations that God speaks on. Later on in, I think it's chapter 9, God says it's not because of your righteousness, it's because of their wickedness that they're getting driven out. And then later, I mean, in what God says, he says to him, be faithful, and if you don't do this, you will be driven from the land.
Yeah.
Which is like, if you act like other nations, you're going to get treated like other nations.
That's good.
So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Also here at the middle of chapter 4, it says, "Take care lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God when he made it with you and made carved." Take care lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and make a carved image, the form of anything that the Lord your God has forbidden you. So he's like, be careful. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. And I think that's an interesting characteristic of God, because when we think of jealousy, it's always in a negative context. Like if you read it in the New Testament, it's a negative context. But Dylan, talk to me about the jealousy of God.
No, I was just going to say, one of my favorite lines in a worship song comes from the most overplayed worship song of all time, How He Loves, which opens with, "He is jealous for me." Which is like, we think about that in like a negative connotation, like jealousy is a bad thing. But when you think about it, and I don't know if this is the correct way to think about this, but whenever I think about my wife and how she is jealous of my time, like she wants to spend time with me, she wants to know me more, like, man, how loved does that make me feel? Like that she cares that much, and how I feel the same way towards her, and to know that the God of the universe, who made everything, even someone as weak and as insignificant and as sinful as I am, he was jealous to have me and my love and worship and attention. Like, man, that's that just, I mean, honestly, it gives me a little bit of chills. It just makes me feel so loved and cared for.
Come on, man. And I think the other piece to it is like, when we as people get jealous, we're wanting something that isn't ours. yours. Like that's the whole like you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, you shall not covet your neighbor's, all these things.
Yeah.
And it's like don't want what's not yours. But the reality is like God's jealousy is righteous because it actually belongs to him. And so God's jealousy is about him taking what's rightfully his.
Yeah.
I guess to put one final point on the whole conversation around like what's the balance of obedience leading to blessing, God guaranteeing the covenant. I think it's important for us to realize that like while God does make this like, hey, if you keep your end of the covenant, then you will receive all of these blessings.
Yeah.
Israel doesn't. They don't receive those blessings. They get kicked out of the land, all this stuff. But in his faithfulness, God still promises to rescue and to redeem them. And so I think we can hold both of those things together as long as we keep the emphasis on the faithfulness of God over our ability to like obey, keep our side of things.
Yeah, God doesn't walk away from his covenant, but there are consequences.
Oh, that's a good word. So let's pivot a little bit then. What do we see about God's people in this week's reading?
Well, God surely says to remember a lot, which could imply that we're not so great at remembering.
Yeah. Which we've seen. Like we get, Moses holding up his staff and God parting the Red Sea, the people coming through, and then, a few days later they're like, we're kind of hungry, like God hates us. It's like, no, stop.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sure does seem that we as people are not so good at remembering and living out of who God is and what he's done.
Yeah. We have a there's one section in here where God's people are just doing real poorly. We see one of this, I won't say it's the first because it's not, but we see a really bad instance of idol worship. I think maybe the first instance of Baal worship.
I think you're right.
I think I could be wrong. Forgive me if I am.
Which, quick timeout. Probably we're going to come over the name Baal a lot in the rest of our reading, so maybe worth a second to talk about, like, what is Baal? Why is that such a big issue? A couple of the big pieces with Baal that we should know is the Canaanites thought that Baal was in charge of fertility, both in terms of, like, being able to have kids, but also in terms of crops and whether or not it rained. So water is a big imagery thing with Baal, which is going to matter symbolically because God's going to do a bunch of stuff with water and be like, you have no power here. But that's Baal, and one of the really disturbing parts of Baal worship is it often involved the sacrifice of children. And so one of the things that we gruesomely need to be aware of as we move into the conquest narrative is child sacrifice in service to Baal and other idols like him is a common practice in the land and something that God utterly despises.
And self-harm.
Yeah.
We see a lot. It's really bad.
So we get Baal worship. That's who Baal is. Keep going.
Yeah. So it specifically says that the Israelites entered into Baal worship because of a very important reason. They started to intermingle with women of other nations, the women of Moab.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of times we see judgment, like Makayla said, like these people are to be devoted to complete destruction. And we're like, ooh, that looks bad. But then we see the product of when that doesn't happen.
Yeah. No, the only other thought that I had on that whole narrative of the Baal worship at Mount Peor is, and it's not the point of the story, but I think it's worth noting, that there is this link between sexual sin and spiritual promiscuity, if you will. Like, as the people of Israel's eyes are drawn to these foreign people they're not supposed to have, and as they engage in the sexual sin, not only are they like being physically unfaithful, but there is a spiritual unfaithfulness that follows.
Yeah, I was going to say at the beginning, right before we get the whole Phineas story, the beginning of chapter 25, it says, while Israel lived in, sounds bad, I'm not going to say the name of the town, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. And I think in our modern understanding, it's kind of a weird word to throw in there, but it's exactly what you just described. That it's like God is saying, you are mine. I am a jealous God. You are my betrothed. And you're whoring yourself after these other gods. And there's a intensity to the language there that I think is significant. But it can sound kind of weird.
It can sound kind of weird. And again, this isn't exactly the point the story's getting after, but I do think in our modern world it's an important reminder. Ultimately all sin leads us to more sin, and all sin pulls us away from our relationship with God. But there does seem to be something particular about like sexual sin that does not only lead to like, you know, the consequences of that and all that good stuff, but also like it does something to our hearts, and it pulls our hearts away from God. And I think in a world and a culture that wants to minimize that, it's worth us recognizing that there's some kind of link there, and it's not even like what we were talking about earlier. Like it's not to be messed with. It's not to be played with. Makayla, before we move into some of the weirder parts of the story this week, before we were talking, you were describing Deuteronomy and specifically like what the book is, and I do think it's helpful.
Context.
Before we move into that.
Yeah, the way I had it described to me is because when we start reading Deuteronomy coming out of Numbers, you're like, I've read this before. This sounds familiar. Why are we repeating ourselves? And that's because the context is Moses, you know, has just been told by God, hey, you're not going into the promised land.
Right.
Like Joshua is going to be the one. Like at the end of Numbers, we see that transfer of leadership from Moses to Joshua. Yeah. Because Moses has sinned and God has said, you don't get to go in. So Deuteronomy is Moses' last sermon, so to speak, to the people of Israel before they go in and receive the blessing, and Moses does not go with them. So there's a significance in that these are the last words that Moses is going to speak to the people of Israel. So I think that we should give it a little extra weight, because if like you knew like the last time you were going to get to speak to your parents or your siblings or your loved ones, like you would be super intentional with your words. And so this is Moses's last sermon.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's pivot. There's some weird stuff in the text. I think the two things that I want to talk about, and if there's anything else y'all want to throw in there, that's great. We got to talk about the talking donkey, and we should probably talk about like what's up with these sons of Anak, the Rephaim, and they keep showing up. They took real center stage at points in this, and we probably should talk about like what's going on there.
Yeah.
So, talking donkey.
I think we need to understand the whole story in order to understand the donkey. So, we see the Israelites set out to continue to make their way to the Promised Land after a pretty big military victory against the king of Og. And they come up to the plains of Moab, I believe, and the king of Moab, a guy named Balak, I believe he was king.
Yep,
he was. Is pretty frightened. Is heard about what they've done, and is like, oh boy, I'm next. And so he summons a guy who we're not really given a whole lot of info about who this guy is.
None.
So Balak summons Balaam, who is known for being a prophet, some kind of spiritual authority, and basically says, hey, I need you to come and curse the people of Israel.
Yeah.
And Balaam has I think, good response. Is like, well, let me go see what the Lord has to say.
Yeah, which is an interesting thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's also never explained. Here's this, like, dude who seems to be named after Baal, who is some kind of weird spiritualist, who's like, let me pray to God.
Yeah. And maybe it's, some syncretism.
Probably, but just weird.
Yeah, very strange. So we see multiple instances where he's like, I'm going to go pray to God, and then rejects Balak a couple different times. And then Balak's like, dude, I will make you insanely rich. Like, if you just come and curse these people for me. And eventually, God says, okay, yeah, go. And then we run into the first weird part of this story. God gives Balaam, confirm, like, yeah, go if this good dude's summoning you. And then we see Balaam head out, he mounts his donkey and leaves. And then it literally says, but God's anger was kindled because he went. And the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as his adversary. Which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, God, didn't you just tell him to go?
If the men come and call you, go. So Balaam rose and went, and God was angry. And you're like,
But we're kind of given a little bit of explanation for this a little later on, as to why this specifically happened. Makayla, you mentioned earlier, I think at the end of this passage, there's something to suggest that Balaam went because he seemed to be motivated by monetary gain.
Yeah, I'll be honest. The text itself isn't obvious that that's what's going on. It was in the commentary notes.
Yeah.
Which I'm not sure how much of that is just like original language might have hinted to that, or
Yeah.
just
Best guess.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, later on in the New Testament, way later on, Balaam is actually mentioned a few times in the Old Testament, always in a negative connotation, understandably so. But Peter actually refers to Balaam as someone who earned his wages from wickedness. And so I think based on what, commentary authors say, original language studies, what we see in the New Testament, Balaam was a pretty greedy guy, and maybe when he set off was like, well, let me go make some coin here, and actually end up cursing the Israelites. And God says no to that and sends what we see, a theophany, the angel of the Lord, to stand in his way to contend with him. And Balaam can't see this.
Yeah.
But his talking
Which
donkey
is
can.
so ironic because the footnotes referred to him as a pagan seer, which is a seer is just someone who like messes with the spiritual world.
Yeah.
But the irony is too thick for me. Of like, he's a pagan seer and he cannot see.
Yeah, but his donkey can.
The true angel of the Lord, God.
Yeah. And so he's on his way. Donkey sees this thing, is terrified. I shouldn't say this thing. Sees the angel of the Lord. That felt disrespectful. And Donkey's obviously terrified, decides to go a different way, and does this multiple times to where Balaam just starts beating the snot out of his donkey. Like, just beating this poor
it's
animal.
tough.
Yeah, until eventually they get to this point to where they can't go to the left or the right or turn back because the angel of the Lord is right there, and the donkey lays down. But anyways, and then we see God open the mouth of this donkey and says what?
Yeah.
It reminds me of the passage, I should know this and I don't, I think of the New Testament where it talks about the rocks will cry out. Like if we're not faithful, even the rocks will cry out. It's like, you're so oblivious, even the donkey is going to like see and proclaim who God is. I just think there's some irony there.
Yeah.
Man. Yeah, it seems like some of that, some of just like, I mean, I can do whatever I want to. I'm God. I'll use the pagan and I'll use the donkey.
Yeah.
But it's a weird story.
It is.
It
Okay.
is very odd.
I feel like now it's your favorite time.
We'll talk about the sons of Anak. So there's a few times that these people show up. They're the reason that the 10 spies are terrified to go into the land. They say the sons of Anak are there. In the text here, we get the Anakim, we get the Rephaim. We're told that like King Og of Bashan was this huge dude whose bed was like 13 feet long or something like that. There's this idea that he was some kind of enormous giant. And so one of the things we have to reckon with as we read the conquest narratives is it seems that there were giants who lived in the land. Now, don't think like Greek mythology giants. Think like really tall, really big people. There's one very famous giant that we'll get to in a little while. That's Goliath. Goliath is called one of the Rephaim. He's from the city of Gath, which is one of the places that these folks are supposed to be living, and we're specifically told that his brother is one of these guys. So we don't have a ton of context on this, except for they seem to be linked to that weird story that we read way back in Genesis 6, where the sons of God saw the daughters of man, took them, and had these illicit hybrid children that get called the Nephilim. There's not a lot of information given in Scripture, but evidently the Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, they're all kind of interchangeable words that refer to these giant humans. Now, there's a few reasons that matters. One is the people of Israel are terrified of them because apparently they're really tall and really strong, and God is saying, "You think that's power? Watch this. I'm just gonna wipe them out." Two, I think there's a reason that as they're getting ready to go back into the land, God makes such a big deal about it because this was what the people of Israel were so afraid of, and God's basically saying like, "You had nothing to worry about. I've had this the whole time." And then the other piece, and this one is much more conjecture, but I do think it's helpful. There's obviously the connection of like you need to destroy the people of the land because there's this connection that they lead to idolatry. But when we get the flood in Genesis 6, it's directly after this story of the Nephilim, and God says, "I'm going to wipe out the whole world." Is there a connection? We don't really know, but it does seem like God is really upset about what's happened here. And before God's saying completely destroy these people, we're also told that these like Rephaim are present there. And so it also, we don't know, but it may help to give a little bit of context for the conquest narratives. But the biggest thing is like to know the reason that these people keep showing up and Israel's so scared of them is they're very tall and they're very strong. But we're going to see throughout the story is that they have no real power because God is infinitely greater than even these giants are.
Yeah.
You have a question for us this week?
Yeah. I mean, if you were going to get, or one day, we kind of already said this, but it's fine. One day when we get to heaven, hopefully there are animals. Maybe they'll be talking. Instead of a talking donkey, is there another creature you'd like to talk to?
Honey badger. Without question, honey badger. Dude, imagine the things a honey badger would say.
Man.
Like, I saw a video 2 weeks ago, probably, of a honey badger fighting an elephant. It does not win. It gets knocked. I kid you not. This thing gets knocked out 2, maybe 3 times. Wakes up and goes and attacks the elephant again.
Like
Dude,
a little dog. They
I
just
have
don't
to
let
know.
up.
I have to know what a honey badger would say.
That's
If
awesome.
it could talk.
I mean, it's super cliche. I mean, I'd love to talk to my dog and just have like an
Oh,
actual
yeah.
conversation. Like me and Nelson could talk through a few things. Be like, why are you doing this, man?
Yeah.
I think he talks. He kind of has a voice like this, so that'd be fun.
Do you speak on behalf of Nelson like
Regularly.
That?
So it'd be nice to actually give him some voice.
Oh,
What about
amazing.
you?
I love the imagery in like the Chronicles of Narnia as like God is Aslan as the lion form. So it's
Yeah.
like, I'd love to talk to a lion.
That would be sick.
That's
Come
it.
on. I love it. Well, thanks for joining us for another week of HSM Reads the Bible, the podcast. We'll see you next week.